Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcasts and YouTube videos. Very pleased today to once again to be joined by my former colleague, Rodney Howsare. We're going to be tag teaming again today. We're going to be interviewing someone I have really admired his work for a while now. And we're going to be talking about a book of his today that Rodney and I both think it's very important. I'm talking about Dr. David Deane. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've admired both your work for quite some time now, and so this is a real thrill.
Oh, very good. Let me give a quick biography here. Are you still associate professor of theology at the Atlantic School of Theology? Very good.
I am indeed. That's me.
And PhD in theology from Trinity College, the University of Dublin, and as a former research fellow of the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences. His books include Nietzsche and Theology, Nietzsche and Thought, and Christological Anthropology. Now, there's another one I need to get. And Still Unhealed, Treating the Pathology and the Clergy Sexual Abuse Crisis. I'm reading this in the back of your current book, and I'm thinking, wow, you were really covering some bases here. You live in Nova Scotia with your wife and children. Are you a Canadian, or you just happen to reside in Nova Scotia?
I am a permanent resident of Canada, but I'm Irish and will remain so. I've got ancestors who would do cartwheels in their grave if I swear an oath of loyalty to any British monarch.
What county in Ireland?
Tipperary, although from about 18 on, I was in Trinity in Dublin, and so all the good parts of me have been leavened out by Dublin.
Very good. I've only been to Ireland twice, both times in the West. You know, the whole touristy Ring of Kerry and all that business. Anyway, I love Ireland. Anyway, we're going to talk about your book, and I'm going to hold it up for those who are viewing. I can never get, it's always reverse. It's called The Tyranny of the Banal, or the Banal, however you want to pronounce it, on the renewal of Catholic moral theology. Now, so for those who are just listening, I'll repeat that. The Tyranny of the Banal on the renewal of Catholic moral theology, Dr. David Deane. Rodney and I had not conversed with one another about this at all. I had just purchased the book. And I'll just warn my readers, it is an expensive book. Nevertheless, it's well worth it. And I was reading it thinking, oh my goodness, this book is just fantastic. And then Rodney texted me out of the blue and says, you got to read this book by this guy, David Deane, called The Tyranny of the Banal. I said, oh my God, I just have finished like reading half of it. I haven't quite finished the whole book. I haven't had time. I've read probably about 3/4 of it. And so I'm anxious to sort of finish up. But anyway, thank you for being on the show. This is a very, very important text, and but Rodney, I asked you to sort of change a pace this time around. I'm going to ask you to be the pace car. You're gonna do the leadoff questions here.
Okay, great. Nice to meet you, David. It's always good to put a kind of person with a name and all that good stuff, even if it is through Zoom, through the cyber world. It's a little bit.
Well, I'm just going to interject right now that I already have a prejudice against David because he has a full head of hair, and I'm always supremely jealous of anyone who has a full
David
head of
Schindler-esque.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's a very impressive do that Schindler has. We can only dream.
Anyway, sorry, Rodney, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, that's good. I'm just going to start in with what I think is the sort of central thesis of the book, which it seems to me ought to be obvious, but it certainly is not obvious to most people today. And it's something that I have sensed as a problem for a long time. But the reason I really, really liked your book so much, and the reason I texted Larry out of the blue one day and just said, Chapp, you've got to get a hold of this book, is that it articulates something that I've kind of had a fuzzy picture of for a long time, but I never have seen anybody really articulate it this clearly and this cogently. And so essentially, I'll just kind of, in a sense, paraphrase what I think about the thesis, and then I would like to have you comment on it a little bit for us. But it seems to me that what you're arguing is that modern people have a tendency to see moral arguments as simply moral arguments. sort of just hanging in thin air. We Catholics believe X, Y, Z about this, and then the typical secular modern person believes X, Y, Z about it. Let's find out what the problem is here and try to do it. And you make a really interesting point at the beginning that, even modern Catholics don't find the positions of the church to be, they may begrudgingly put up with them, but they don't find them convincing, and many don't even think it's worth trying to live up to them. So could you go through that a little bit? How is it that we have gotten to the place where even Catholics don't find Catholic moral positions to be credible anymore? What has happened?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a story that I tried to tell in the chapter on abortion. The three moral sites are a little bit standalone, and the abortion chapter tells a story about how slowly but surely the Catholic approach to abortion got disconnected from its dogmatic foundations, which led to Sanchez de Azpilicueta, a whole host of really troublesome Renaissance Catholic theologians. And then when the church critiqued that, it didn't reconnect it to the fundamental theology that was driving it. It simply looked at the propositions themselves. And when we do that, we can inadvertently lose sight of the lifeblood or of how it works. And so you've got very many Roman Catholics who are driving cars, and they kind of know how to make it go from A to B, but they have no idea how it works. And that becomes a real problem when all of a sudden it gets disconnected from the logic. And so many of the things that we believe to be true, or we hold to be true, we've forgotten why we hold them to be true. And when that happens, we become secular modernists by osmosis, and that's one of the challenges that we have in modern Catholicism, that even when we seemingly oppose secular modernism, we use the epistemology and ontology of secular modernism to do so, and therefore we need to, I think, reconnect moral theology to its dogmatic, ultimately to its Trinitarian roots. This is to tell that story of the genealogy of how it got to this situation. We could speak about it in many different ways, but Larry, you're good friends with Lewis Ayres, and Lewis Ayres is constantly banging on, quite rightly, about the siloization of theological disciplines. And the siloization of theological disciplines has served Catholic theology in particular ill, and that's never more so than in Catholic moral theology. Honestly, when I read so much Catholic moral theology in the last 50 years, it's rubbish. It's absolutely rubbish. And we have a crisis. It's an entire crisis in the discipline. I just got snippets of Larry's chat with Mike Aquila, speaking about the robust state of theology since the council, and it's very rare that Larry says something that I'm going, really? But that was one time that I'm not 100% sure. The localization of theology within the universities has produced a theological culture that has had its ass smacked for the last century. The faith has been collapsing, and we theologians have to are responsible for that. And so the book tries to say, okay, here's why, here's how this works, here's how the Catholic understanding of life functions, here's how the Catholic understanding of sexuality functions. Here we're going to knit it back to see what Aquinas and Augustine and many others are doing behind the scene, and here's how it works. Now, again, in many ways, your guys, von Balthasar and others, have done these kind of things before, but hopefully, while it's not particularly novel, it can make a contribution to that work.
Well, way to trash the one time in all of my podcasts where I've actually been positive about the modern church. my lame attempt at optimism. It was
off brand. It was
yeah, it was certainly off brand. Oh yeah. I guess I was thinking that there are, contrary to what was true before the council, there is, I think, a significant number. Maybe it's not robust or exploding everywhere. You're correct about that, but I think there's a significant number of young up and coming. I think of somebody like you, or the guys over at New Polity. And things like that. But anyway, that's off topic.
And your point about women theologians was fantastic. That there was no Tracy Rowlands or
Jenny
Jennifer
Martins,
Martin, before the council, and so that was
Margaret
important.
Turek. Yeah, I forgot to mention Margaret Turek in the talk. But anyway, back to the point at hand here, and building on Rodney's point. Uh, so you said the moral theology of the church for the past 50 years. I love your Irishism. It's rubbish. All right, it's just been rubbish the past 50 years. Now, maybe you could dive down into that just a little bit further. Uh, all rubbish. I mean, even for example, I studied at Mount St. Mary's Seminary under the late moral theologian Germain Grisey, and he was well known with John Finnison for the sort of the new natural author. So in reading your book, I'm curious about, okay, what do you think of those sorts of the Robert George, Germain Grisey sort of natural law kind of guys?
Yeah, there's lots of good stuff out there. I think that the nature of debate pushed us into certain silos, whereby even the best of us, and they were the best of us, they did amazing work, tended to be caught up in that desire to participate in the broader discourse. Um, Obviously, like yourselves, I'm a massive supporter of the Second Vatican Council. There's a sense in Gaudium et Spes in which the church and theology is participatory in a broader conversation that it contributes to. And you have papal documents in the 70s talking about the European agricultural policy. And the goal is to participate in this, and therefore, legions of priests and religious abandon religious life to do some more real work in social work. And this sense, I think, darkened Catholic moral theology, which focused on the broader secular conversation, when the very things that were the dynamite in Catholic moral theology were the most idiosyncratic things. And so, for example, the basic idea that in moral act A, I accept God's self-giving as the Son, Jesus the Christ, through the Holy Spirit, leading to you know, literally the indwelling of the Trinity in our souls, binding us to the triune life, and that this is what makes a moral action good or not. Aquinas, 90% of the time, 99% of the time we speak about the word good, we're speaking about it analogically. But in that God alone is good, and in that the Trinity can come to dwell in the souls of the just, and in that the Holy Spirit can be the active cause in moral acts, this is what gives it its goodness, and we foreclosed on that in positive and negative ways. The positive ways were when we focused on natural law, which is good, which is true, but it is the cardinal virtues relative to the theological virtues. It is part of the story, but not the whole story, or the majority, and still tragically the vast majority, to whole scale toss out all the Catholic stuff and instead try and meet people where they're at by identifying some arbitrary or contingent end. For example, in Margaret Farley's tremendously well received Just Love, but justice is a contingent end. It's not an ultimate end, and yet it's an attempt to function within a secular social order. It's an attempt to appease the powerful voices in one's peers in the university corridors, and it comes at the cost of sacrificing, who we are. Now, again, there are countless wonderful moral theologians, but the basic thrust of the 20th century, when we wanted to be like the nations, and we wanted to participate in a wider conversation. Obviously, Pope Francis is wonderful, but all the references to the United Nations in like in ID, you know, what's that
Yeah,
about?
yeah,
Who
yeah.
cares?
It's strange. It's strangely kind of globalist and all that. Rodney, I'm going to let you speak in a second, but
Yeah,
I'm gonna get some. I want to piggyback on what
we'll follow up
David
with that. Yeah.
to follow up on what David just said. I've often thought, and it pertains to what you're talking about here, that one of the problems with natural law theory is that very, very often it's construed not by necessarily its main practitioners, but those out engaged in the public square. It's construed as this kind of neutral Catholic language, neutral language where we can meet our secular counterparts on some sort of level playing field, where we're not specifically importing Catholic baggage into our moral equations. We're groping after this thing, and yet the reason why, in my opinion, it doesn't convince is that our secular interlocutors are looking at us and going, the reason why we don't accept natural law theory is because your very theory presumes that we believe in God. Natural
Right.
law is our rational participation in the divine mind and so on. So it presumes not only faith in God, but faith in a particular kind of God, a creator God who has implanted himself and seeds of his intellect in the broader world, and that these patterns can then be recognized and so on. And that this can then be turned into some sort of neutral secular language. I don't think so. So
Yeah.
that's my fervor read. But it seems to me, therefore, that this is the construal that you seem to be really kicking against.
Yeah, and and I have, obviously as someone very influenced, like all of us by Aquinas, um, arguments which seek to reach out to the evidence of the natural order and speak
Yeah.
to God's will for creation. These are very, very good arguments. The sense is that we have within particularly the pro-Nicenes, there is that sense, that grammar, that whether we're talking about liturgy, whether we're talking about the moral life, whether we're talking about preaching, we're talking about spaces for union with the triune life, where we, in embodied fashion, accept God's self-giving. This is, in a sense, why the church is Marian before it's Petrine, because the Blessed Mother's yes, which leads to the real presence of Christ within. This is the church in Nuce. This is the moral life in Nuce. This is liturgy in Nuce. This is why it has its basic Marian, its Marian form. And for some reason, somehow in the 20th century, and maybe even in sections of the 19th, we as a theological discipline seem to have forgotten that. We seem to have to recoiled. John Milbank, in the introduction to theology and social theory, talks about the false humility, and we've recoiled from these brazen claims.
Yes.
And I think that we need to reestablish them, because first and foremost, the task is that Catholics don't get it or buy it. And the horrific thing, and I hate even saying it, but when I say Catholics, I'm not simply talking about various people at the back of the church in the pews. I'm talking about the Vatican. I'm talking about all through the church, that I'm not sure everybody has a clear sense of how this Catholic thing works. And that's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
terrifying.
Yeah. Can I
Rodney.
follow up there? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
this is exactly where the real blood of the book, so to speak, the thing that really got me going, at least when I was reading it, because it's an enormous problem that the church faces in the modern world. And it seems to me that it comes from a number of angles. Part of it is the failure to see Catholicism as a kind of worldview, as a claim about the nature of reality. And then the other part of it is a failure to see that the modern approach to nature is not just sort of the obvious, objective, scientific, universal approach to the thing, right? So I think there's two problems there. The first is that we've allowed Locke to tell us that religion is beliefs about things that go bump in the night. So that's kind of, then religion is in this little box somewhere in the corner of the thing. The other side of it is that we just kind of take for granted that the Enlightenment got nature, science, the human person, the political freedom, et cetera, right. So I think the average Catholic, and you're absolutely right, I think this is deep in the clergy. The average Catholic kind of has this basically Kantian approach to reality, let's call it, to use the guy that you talk about a lot of the book. And then they add on top of that a handful of Catholic beliefs about maybe Christ is present in the Eucharist, maybe the God is three persons in one being, but it's clear that those things have nothing to do with the real world, right? That's really the problem. So Dave, would you mind kind of explaining for the viewers, because they haven't read your book maybe yet, that other moral tradition that you're arguing Catholics have bought into, but they shouldn't? Could you walk us through that a little bit?
That's
the Nietzschean piece. Yeah,
that's exactly
before,
right.
And before you answer that too, I'd like to throw in, I in your comments, speak about what Nietzsche meant when he referred to Kant as sort of the great delay.
The
great delay.
Yeah. So there are many ways to tell this story, and other people have told the story with this genealogy dipping into the stream at various points. One of the reasons why I focus on Kant is because, I think he's the great synthesizer, and it's in Kantian forms that the moves are bequeathed to us today. And one of the fundamental problems in Kant is the bracketing of the noumena. And so outside my window here there are trees, and Hildegard of Bingen and most humans, like, one of the tragedies, and this is a brief aside, one of the great tragedies is not that we've had our arse kicked by secular epistemology, but it's secular epistemology is a tiny minority approach in the history of humanity, and it's a really poor one. And so it's bizarre to think that we've lost to the lamest, to the lamest heresy that we've produced. Anyway, Hildegard sees trees, and so if you want to see a tree or a plant, you've got two perspectives. You've got us looking at the trees, and then you've got God's love for the trees. You've got what's that term? Immensity. This incessant self-giving of God to the natural order in order for it to be. And so the tree and animals and everything, people, are in relationship with God outside of our field of vision. And this gives them a mysteriousness. This gives them a dignity. It's from that perspective. Now, the rage in the modern West, the rage of the Enlightenment is, how do we know? And particularly, how can we know with certainty, which is the Everest that that all epistemological approaches aim for? And Kant says that we can never know that with certainty. We can never know that at all. And so really, epistemologically, we just got to bracket what it is in itself and anything that's outside of our field of vision, and then work with it exclusively as we see it. And what this does is it renders it banal. It robs it of its dignity. It reduces it to its attributes, which, of course, is the basis for an attribute-based notion of human dignity, which drives horrors from abortion to genocide. And it also makes it a commodity. And because it is what it is pro me. It is what it is, not in itself, but for me. And so therefore, whether I see it as firewood or as artistic interpretation or as fruit, it is what it is for me. It becomes a commodity, which leads to the banalization of the natural order and also the commodification of the natural order. And so capitalism, which Marx, in 95% of Marx's work, sees as an economic system, there's also a few percentage points when he starts to see it as an ideology, as an ontology. And if it is an ontology, that's where the ontology really, really emerges, the reduction of the real to the commodity. And so we not only have this in Kant and the philosophers, but we have this, we teach every one of our children in this. This is what we call education. A student the semester before last, he was at a sister university across the road, and he was over from the UAE, an Islamic student, and like, Islamic is Islamic, and so he wasn't finding much support from Muslim scholars at the university. But he knew that I was, a sort of a gaudy type, you know, and so he confided in me one of his problems, and when the problem he had is that he had gotten a very poor grade on an essay on the Battle of Hattin, which was just insane to him because that was his thing. He was an expert. He was obsessed with this. He was obsessed with Saladin from an early age. And the problem was, and it was really eye-opening to me, is that he had spoken a lot in the essay about the reasons for Saladin's victory. And the main one was that it was the will of Allah. you know and this is why he didn't do well in the paper, because that's inadmissible evidence in a Western university. No, you've got to, it's not just that Kant brackets the numenological. If you mention the numenological in our education system, you will fail. you've got to you've got to either believe in the banality of the material world, or you've got to act like it, or else you can't come to these schools. And so this is why it's absolutely absolutely ubiquitous. And all the things that are downstream of this, like an attribute-based understanding of human dignity. Why? Because attributes are measurable and quantifiable. The real is reduced to the measurable and the quantifiable. It leads to horrors. As soon as you have a notion, we should get this written on a rock somewhere. As soon as you have a notion that human dignity rests on attributes, someone will say that these attributes are not commensurate with you having human dignity. And so it's just a matter of time when before before you've genocide, before you have the understanding of human beings as, to use that horrifically painful term, vegetable, that they can lose their human dignity. Canadian great scholar George Grant
Oh yeah.
Is the one who referred to to Kant's work as the great delay, by virtue of the fact that Kant somehow was so successful that we didn't properly hear Nietzsche's critique. We didn't properly hear that it can't sustain us. It can't work. But Grant felt it was only a matter of time before we return to the relativism that Kant just holds off from Hume. He just
Oh, that's right. It was Grant who called it the Great
it
Delay.
was
Yeah,
Grant,
not
yeah,
Nietzsche,
yeah,
but he was talking about Nietzsche. So in my old brain, I got it all addled up. But
yeah.
but go ahead. I interrupted
No,
you, but I think
that's
this.
like that's it. That that Kant does all this because ultimately he wants to try and defend reason, and you can obviously he is convinced, and this is the mistake he makes, that certainty is the telos of reason. Once he makes that mistake, then he has to refuse to accept that forms of rational inquiry that can't lead to certainty are not proper forms of rational inquiry. Therefore, he reduces reality to that which is quantifiable and measurable, and he basically says that we've got to stop talking about God. That God is just a
Yeah.
I believe, which is what he does. It's only a matter of time, and I think this is Grant's point before Nietzsche goes, yeah, I know you're right that you can't have morality without God, so you can't have morality. Like
Yeah.
it's only a matter of time. And the great tragedy, or one of the reasons why it's so embarrassing that like the secular West has triumphed in a sense over Christianity, or is triumphing over Christianity, is that is that bizarrely it pretends that that's not the case. It pretends that you can say that good is not ontologically real, because if there is an ontologically real good, this is God, independently of us, and not realize that therefore what we call good is simply a cultural projection, in which case it is a ruse of power, in which case it is not. Nietzsche knows you can't have morality without God. Kant knew it. All bright people know it. And yet in our world, we play this ridiculous game of assuming that you can have morality without a notion of the good independent of our construction. Either it's independent of our construction, aka God, or it's just a construction, aka
Yeah.
relativism. And the sheer and and why the 20th century and Catholic 20th century theology was so painful is that instead of simply, refuting this idiocy, it has sort of said, yes, we are part of this wonderful new world and it's a wonderful thing, and somehow we've got to participate in it and try and make our own little contribution, and the result is the greatest collapse in Christian history. But I think, there are encouraging signs that we're headed in the right direction. But we do have to, I think, and this is the strength of the new theology. We have to sort of, restore the theological grammars which we've long forgotten. And that can offer us a way out of this.
And it seems too to me that, I mean, the very thing that Kant was trying, as you lay out in your book brilliantly in the opening chapters, the thing that Kant was trying to avoid is sort of the consequences of Hume's position, which would have been a runaway perspectivalism. And it seems as if now we have once again a runaway perspectivalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think that was Grant's prescient insight that it delayed it, but it will come. It is arriving, and whether we accept it or not, and the way people live, I think, shows that in many ways, even if they pretend not to accept that they do. And people have been afraid for a long time of the Christian right. The post-Christian right is something to be afraid of.
Oh my.
Because
Yeah.
there's, for every good young theologian out there. Sorry, Rodney. Yeah, for every good young theologian out there, there's some guy on YouTube who says who's a thoroughgoing Nietzschean. Nietzsche, who says the strong are no more culpable in dominating the weak than an eagle is in swooping down upon its prey, and that's the understanding of the natural order. It's a neo-paganism, and this is what Nietzsche understood when he says, Antichrist, have I not been understood? It is Dionysius versus the crucified. That's always been the either or. And increasingly, as secular liberalism dissolves into its own dumpster, we are left with the Dionysius versus the crucified. We are left with the emergent neo-pagan philosophy of power, and once again the God on the cross, the ontology of peace that comes from the Galilean. Yeah.
Rodney.
If I could add just a kind of a political piece there that isn't explicit in your book, but I think it's there implicitly, and it would be interesting to unpack it a little bit. Is you have to think that maybe Kant even knew more than he pretended to know, in the sense that one of the ways that liberalism claims to work as a political philosophy is to say, okay, so what? If we all end up having fundamentally different moralities. Let's say relativism is what's going to result when I reduce certitude to the phenomenal realm and all that. Because he says is it Perpetual Peace, where he says that if you just get the right system in place, you could have a nation of devils and it would still turn out okay, because our mutual selfishness would check each other by allowing a state to come in and adjudicate rights battles and all of this stuff. And I think one of the things that's somewhat hopeful, even though it's a bad thing, is more and more people are beginning to realize that kind of lie of liberalism, that things will work out okay, even if we all are fundamentally selfish and we don't have any virtues, because out of self-interest, I'm not going to steal your wallet because I don't want you to steal mine, or I'm not going to kill your kids because I don't want you to kill mine, or whatever. We're beginning to realize, both in the economic realm and in the moral and social realm, that that's not working. That in fact, people really are looking out for their own interest, and it really is hurting the interests of other people. And the secular state is not able to prevent it, or doesn't care about preventing it, because they're in bed with
or fosters it. Yeah.
Or fosters it, or whatever. So that's just kind of an interesting piece, I think, that that could almost work as an appendix in the book, of kind of what are the political structures that have allowed us to buy into this for so long, that kind of absolute moral relativism or moral chaos really doesn't matter. Who cares? It's all going to be okay. It all comes out in the wash. So
and to piggyback on, I mean, I interviewed Ken Craycraft about his recent book on theology and politics. And the thing that struck me about his book was that his description of the modern world is largely not Kantian, but Hobbesian. Uh, that we've made a sort of, and as I was reading your book, I was struck by the fact, Kant sounds strangely Hobbesian here in his description of the state sort of protecting us all from our own selfishness, and that it'll all come out in the wash, so to speak.
Yeah, that that aspect of my read of Kant comes via Barth. There was a section in the Dogmatics where Barth, he's talking about human fallenness, and he says that, as Kant wrote, man is inclined by nature to hate both God and his neighbor. And I'm going, what? That's crazy. And sure enough, I tracked down the footnote, and there was the uber Calvinist Kant, who was there at the heart of it, and that's, I think, what drives Perpetual Peace, the essay on perpetual peace, which is one of the most terrifying essays ever written. That the totalitarianism will ultimately save us, and this is the tragedy. The tragedy is that whereas Christianity, in some ways uniquely, has a grammar such that a good society depends on good people, and therefore the primary task is, how do we take a scumbag like David Deane and make him more conform to Jesus Christ, which involves shaping his desires. And if that can't happen, then it won't work. And as Rodney says, many people who support the secular liberal capitalist project will say, but that's okay because we'll all balance out. But we see now in two good examples of where that's absolute, the error in that is visible, is with the environmental crisis, that ultimately you simply cannot make, legislate meaningful change if people don't love creation. If they don't love the natural order, then they will abuse it. There's a section in Marx which doesn't get enough play, but he talks about the growth of the Industrial Revolution and how it's linked to this notion of the desacralization of the natural order. That when you have that old crazy Hildegardian notion, that a sort of basic Christian notion, that there is a dignity in the natural order because of God's love for it. Once you have that, that's going to impede the growth of capitalism. But as soon as you render it banal, then you can do what you will with it. And this drives the Industrial Revolution, which drives the environmental catastrophe. And it's bizarre, here in Canada we have pathetic attempts to try and it's almost poignant that they make us use see-through plastic bin bags, so our neighbors can shame us if we're not recycling properly. They're hoping that somehow those forces that Rodney touched on can save us, but they can't. And of course, the second thing is online spaces where it's where you can get away with it. It's that sense of, David Ford always asked that. He said that the fundamental question in the Hebrew Bible is, and in the Greek Old Testament, do you love God for God's sake? Can you be good when no one's watching? And without a grammar of ontological transformation, there is no hope for the world. Which is not to say that politics can't hopefully mediate between greater and lesser horrors in the meantime. And that's I think the goal of the political, but the theological has got to focus on helping people know the good, relate to the good, be ontologically transformed by the good, and actually becoming good through similarity, good through participation. And
Yeah.
And somehow we forgot that within the moral life. We forgot that in our grammar of the moral life. And when I hear so many Catholics, high-standing Catholics in the Vatican, speak about what being good is, they still have this strange idea that, you act however you act, and then God will ruffle your hair and go, I can't stay mad at you, and let you into heaven.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of grammar which is utterly bizarre, utterly bizarre. It's so yeah, we have a lot of work to do, I think, in this regard.
Yeah.
Reminds me of C.S. Lewis and the Problem of Pain, where he says we don't so much desire a good God as we desire a kind God, a sort of senile benevolence in this guy who just like ruffles our
Absolutely.
hair and says, "Oh, don't worry about it. Here's a quarter. Go have an ice
Yeah,
cream." You know,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
In
Yeah,
that
we want
regard,
God as an old and slightly inebriated uncle. That's 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 the God we
I
really
agree.
want. You know?
But I
Yeah.
want to come back to sort of Rodney's original question, the major thesis of the book, which is that our moral theology has, in a sense, veered away from its mooring in the great truths of Revelation. And I was somewhat critical earlier of a certain kind of natural law theory, but as you correctly point out, we all love Aquinas. That's not to deny analogy. It's not to deny that one sees aspects of God's nature. So natural law arguments are fine. So my question though would then be, what does a David Deane moral theological argument look like in terms? I mean, let's take abortion, or you can use any example you
Yeah.
want, but abortion comes to my mind right here. How does that play out as a Catholic in the public domain in constructing a moral theological argument that a Catholic could accept first and foremost, would
Yeah.
understand, and then in a way that you think would be a proper way of doing it?
Yeah. So, and this is where I think many people and maybe even yourselves would, would disagree with me that for me, I think the primary, at least my primary focus, and this is not to say everybody's primary focus should be, is not the public domain. Ultimately, what you have with abortion and why abortion is unthinkable for a number of reasons, but for one, the Holy Spirit literally rests in the soul of the unborn. The soul, Aquinas, talks about it. It has a kind of two parents. It comes from God's self gift with immensity, and then it also is produced by the body, is the form of the body. And at one stage, he talks about it like you're rubbing your hands together and you produce heat. And the soul is the form of the body, and this soul is the site of God's self-giving for relationship with God. An act of violence against the unborn is an excruciating and in one sense literal act of violence against the Holy Spirit. It is unthinkable. It also, for example, refuses the lordship of God by virtue of the fact, and this is a kind of a little bit weird, but as we know from the God's eye perspective, there is no linear time. Past, present, and future are one in God, and therefore it is not simply devotion to Aristotle that leads to the tradition seeing the person as an amalgam of actuality and potentiality. It is also because reality is the God's eye perspective, and therefore the God's eye perspective is not just the person as they are; it's the person as they will be. Abortion refuses that, ruptures it, and destroys not just an actuality but a potentiality. And we all, on some level, and here I would tip the cap to natural law, or a form of natural law. We all, on some level, understand that. My daughter is 11. If she died tomorrow, God forbid, everyone would be sadder than if the lady down the road who's 101, if she died tomorrow. We'd all be sad, but we know on some level that while they've lost the exact same in terms of actuality, they've lost completely different things in terms of potentiality. And so we know that the person is an amalgam of actuality and potentiality. And then you could talk about the various Hawasian points about hospitality and so on and so forth. But that would be my primary focus, to help people see that 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 a proper understanding of the human person, a proper understanding of God's relationship with the world, a proper understanding of the natural order, a proper understanding of the person as the site for reception of God's self-giving, ought make abortion unthinkable. And many of these arguments are not going to work in the public sphere, which is. And I don't know what to do about that. Like, I speak a lot about that is sort of that if you have two different understandings of reality. And again, I know I'm talking to, von Balthasar, the Lubach people, but this is one of the things which I do appreciate about Garrigou-Lagrange's essay, "Where is the New Theology Leading Us?" That he makes the point that it is not that this theology, worked with Aristotle and now this theology has got to work with Kant. He was saying this theology works with Aristotle because Aristotle will write about the nature of reality in the same way Plato was, in the same way that Islam is, in the same way that the vast majority of people who ever thought are right about the nature of reality. Your understanding of reality is uniquely bad. And so we also have to do deconstructive work. I think that we can't necessarily prove that the soul is a site for God's self-giving through the Holy Spirit conforming us to the Son. But what we can do, I think, and what I try to do, is to show why abortion has become something akin to a sacrament in the modern West. Why an attribute-based model of human personhood is disastrous. Why to accept this is also to accept, and be participant in countless horrors. The whole notion of choice as the pathetic only real in the modern West. That that notion that you have in Camus and Sartre and others, that it is ridiculous, it is absurd, there is no meaning, but at least I can choose to use an iPhone or an Android. I can choose to drink milk or to drink water, and all of a sudden this choosing thing becomes the only real. And therefore it gets a sort of sacramentalized. Therefore choice becomes this shibboleth that we bow down to. And I think we should be able to show that, as Pope Francis does, that you can't have this without a commitment to the fundamental grammar of tyrannical capitalism. You can't have this without an understanding of the natural order as fundamentally banal. And so we can't get them to see the truth, which requires relationship with the triune life, to see it in its fullness. But we can show the beauty and coherence of our perspective while also showing the problems and indeed the horror with the alternative. And I think that's how moral argumentation must proceed, in that stereophonic way, showing the beauty, coherence of the Catholic perspectives and the problems with the secular banal perspectives.
I like that. And then Rodney, you can piggyback after I'm done here. What I like about it, when I said, how would a David Deane argument look like, sort of, if we're presenting this to the public, I don't mean, I'm fully aware that none of our arguments are going to be all that persuasive given the current septic tank of a culture in which we live that is dominated precisely by the tyrannical banality of capitalism. Now, however, I absolutely just adored your past 5 minutes. I felt like I was in class getting this wonderful dissertation on how moral theology should proceed, because one of the things that it does, and then Rodney, you can chime in too, one of the things that it does is it bursts precisely this enlightenment-based distinction between what counts as private and what counts as public. In other words, that these precise Christian arguments that you're making, the Holy Spirit and all our participation in the Trinity and stuff, action potential, all of these sorts of arguments are sort of quasi-theological or directly theological arguments, and yet those are public arguments. This has always been the Christian claim. These are not private truths. The resurrection, though witnessed only by a few hundred perhaps, is the most public event in the history of the world. And in this sense, in this theological sense, it's the most defining public event in the history of the world. So, Rodney, maybe you can follow up with a question before David answers.
Yeah, I have some thoughts that go along with what you were saying, David. I'm very, very sympathetic. I there's almost, everything that you just said for the last 5 minutes too. I was just like, yes, 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 yes. So I don't think, I think, again, this is something we've allowed the Enlightenment to tell us, is that you can have Christian values without Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the great service that Nietzsche did, is to call, bullcrap on that, that you what he called the British flatheads for believing that you could have that kind of thing.
The English disease.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think he's absolutely right about that. So I think that's one thing that it might be an effective thing, is to remind the modern world where they're getting the values they're getting from. And then what happens is, is this kind of pointing out the inconsistency of just wanting to draw the line in different places. So the logic that protects the unborn is the same logic that presents the immigrant or the refugee, right? All of these, quote, losers, according to Nietzsche's categories, are people that we're going to want to protect precisely because God loved them into existence, and therefore they have every bit as much value to God as we do, right? So whether we're richer than they are or whatever. Liberalism still likes a lot of that. Yep. Right? It still wants it, and different parties want parts of it, right? Like the left wants certain Christian values, the right wants certain Christian values. Neither one of them wants all of the Christian values because they push and stuff. So that would be, I think, something to just, I think that's just an important point to make, is that yes, our morality is distinctively Christian.
Yeah.
So what, sue me or whatever. But one other thing that I think is important, and this I think is something you kind of brought in at the end, and I was wondering as I was reading the book about this, the way Benedict does this, it seems to me, and I think he's just exemplary for how to retrieve some of these questions too, is he's always both doing very distinctively Christian moral theology. When he does moral theology, he's not afraid he's not afraid to draw on the full tradition, revelation, and the whole bit. But he also laments the loss of that great metaphysical, philosophical tradition which Augustine and Aquinas were building on. So they weren't just doing kind of positivistic appeals to scripture. The Bible says so, or something like that. They were coming up with a kind of a worldview, if you will, or forming a worldview out of this Greek philosophical tradition on the one hand, and then the biblical tradition on the other, and bringing those two together into a kind of synthesis, which was really a powerful worldview, I would call it, and for, with all the dangers that come with that word. And that's precisely what the Enlightenment almost explicitly, intentionally rejects, that the synthesis between Greek and biblical thought is precisely it's rejected, even all the way back, I think, to Occam and to some degree, and Luther and all that stuff. So that, I think, is something that I want to give kudos to Ratzinger for insisting that synthesis of Greek and biblical thought was a very, very powerful thing, and losing it is going to be very catastrophic.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I would also add a footnote that basic understanding of the natural order as in terms of created and uncreated, sanctified and sanctifying, whatever categories that we're thinking about, these are the natural human way of seeing it. That certainly the Greek philosophical tradition is one of the clearest expressions, but even ass backwards pagans like us Irish back in the day, we still have the same basic shape. And the modern secular capitalist West replaces those with the bastard binaries of faith and reason, of nature and supernature, and one of these things is not like the other. That we're living through this uniquely different time frame. And of course, Milbank, I think he's right to suggest that that the seculars are religion in disguise, but unlike other religions that can talk and fight and debate, it wants to be the unique and sole religion, and annihilates all other religions, and refuses their voice in public space. And in relation to Larry's point, which is again another brilliant point, recently I've realized that I'm not doing that well so here in Nova Scotia, we've got a lot of TV, local, like a national TV hubs. And so because of that, and because of the fact that I never say no, if they want someone to talk about, whether it's a new pope, or it's the Blessed Mother appearing in a slice of toast in Guadalajara, I'll get roped in. And it struck me recently that oftentimes when that happens, I I live action role play as a secularist, you know, that I pretend that the world is as the Enlightenment has seen it, because I want them to like me. I want them to not
Right.
think I'm a chick. And that level of cowardice is something that I've a sort of committed to like to trying to move beyond, and to do exactly what you're saying, to simply be Catholic, and to refuse the you know the like the tyrannies of banal, to refuse the notion that
Yeah.
we can't be out about these things. But it's that lure. It's that lure of power. It's that lure of where we want social acceptance, we want affirmation. And that's something that I think we all need to, I in particular, need to beware of in order to be courageously who we're called to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's an art, not a science. So don't be too hard on yourself, I think, Dave, because I think we all suffer a little bit from that kind of, I don't know if cowardice is the right word. There's a certain trepidation because uh and I know that when I speak publicly about these hot button issues and so on, I'm I'm definitely at what trying to get the truth of the Christian message across, but I'm also at the same time trying to distance myself from the loony right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
that you
yeah,
don't want to sound like Archbishop Vigano.
yeah,
I want to make it very clear now that I'm not
yeah,
saying
yeah,
extra.
yeah,
So you have all these
yeah,
caveats, death by a thousand paper cuts, and then
yeah,
you end up sounding like you agree more with the sort of the Enlightenment
yeah,
biases than otherwise. But anyway,
I think there's a natural, I mean, I think there's a wisdom there, actually, to be honest with you, where even Paul in Acts, his preaching style is going to change depending on what his audience is going to accept. And I think there's a prudential thing there where we have to figure out, how am I going to talk to this person, and how am I going to talk to that person, and how am I going to talk to this person? And I do think it takes shrewd as serpent, as innocent as doves. I think there's a lot of
right,
shrewdness involved there. I actually think that the Bishop Barron is really good at, like, who he's really good at feeling out who's my audience,
yeah,
what can I say, how should I
right,
say
yeah,
it, without in any way watering down the
but
faith.
this is a perfect example. I don't want to take us too far off course, but I mean, for example, Bishop Barron takes it on the nose from the hard Catholic right for his interview with Ben Shapiro, right? The Jewish Ben Shapiro. And where he didn't essentially say to Ben Shapiro, Ben, unless you convert to Catholicism, your soul is in danger of going to hell right here, right now. If you die,
yeah,
you're probably going to go to. I mean, it's a bit of a caricature, but when you read the critique, you realize, well, what were they asking him to do? Because when you watch the entire 1 hour long interview that Barron has with Shapiro, it's very clear that he does evangelize Ben Shapiro. He just
yeah,
doesn't do it in that blunt instrument kind of way. So, in other words, Roddy, I agree with you
yeah,
completely.
yeah,
That it's more art than science.
right,
It's a difficult thing to do.
hmm,
Um, but anyway, I want to come back. Then I don't want to go too far down that particular rabbit hole. But I wonder, David, then in a sense, where do you think, in a sense, where will we be in 20 years? I mean, I know you're not a futurist and that sort of thing. Uh, I tend to be very pessimistic. I am very dystopian in my vision of what the future is our future in the West is going to be like. So what is your take on this? And what are the Christian prospects in terms of our argument, our grammar, as you like to put it? How 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 far down into the pits of hell are we going to have to descend before our world comes to its senses and sees that the Christian grammar actually has something of value in it, public value in it?
yeah. So anything I have to say, you already know. I was reading this morning some letters from Basil of Caesarea to Athanasius, and the basic sense is, this is as bad as it's ever been. How have we gotten ourselves into this position?
Yeah.
And but I will agree 100% that that the tyranny of banal has never been as tyrannical, that the level of idiocy, the problematic understanding of the real has never been as hegemonic as it is now. The things that I would say that do give me hope is one, um, we are, like the old Baltimore Catechism had it right, who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? That no man love him in this life and be happy with him in the next. I think that's true, and because it's true, the number of nuns and the number of NONES, the number of atheists have plateaued and are starting to decline. The mass attendance in North America hasn't declined at the same rate at all since 2008. There's a number of statistics which indicate that things are better. I do believe that things are improving in the church. If you give me someone my age, or you give me someone who's 25 in the church, I'm back in the 25-year-old to have a better Catholic grammar than someone in their 50s, and beyond, even worse. I do think that we have a really significant opportunity, and I do believe that we'll take that opportunity. Now, again, society on the whole, I'm wary of, but I do think that things are better than they were. I was an undergrad in the 90s, and I think that like you guys will remember this. You'll remember what it was like being a student in theological faculties that were secular humanists, that were embarrassed and ashamed of Catholicism. I stopped going to the Catholic Theological Society of America because I just couldn't hack it anymore. I couldn't hack the smug idiocy of people who knew nothing about the church fathers, just sort of, seeing them as embarrassing relics of hatred and misogyny, and, like turning up their nose at the church. And it was just awful. And things are better, I think, now. I haven't been back, but I suspect they are somehow. And so I think that we are, I hate to use Ranner's notion of smaller but stronger, but I think that I think there has been a theological winnowing, and I think that from that good things are emerging. And I think I'm positive about the future of the church. I'm less positive about the future of our social order. I think that in the same way the church was doing well as Rome was collapsing, so too we are in a sort of hopefully a post-Nicene era where we can promulgate good ideas and good grammars, while all around us the world is not doing great.
Yeah, my take on the CTSA, and Rodney can talk to this too, on the CTSA phenomenon and the kinds of theologians you met there, I agree with you completely. The sheer lunacy, idiocy, because what it's always seemed to me was this, is that what those kinds of theologians were people who simply accepted the grammar of modern secularity as normative, as the boilerplate, and they would then so in a sense theologically they were a conclusion in search of an argument at that point. All right, their conclusion is, well, the secularity is right about XYZ, therefore the church needs to change XYZ. Now I need to back engineer so-called Catholic arguments to sort of justify all of this. And they were awful arguments. They butchered the church fathers, butchered Aquinas, and so on and so forth. So I agree with you. The difference between today and then, it seems to me, amongst a certain younger generation, not just of Catholic theology, but of Catholics in general, is that they're not a conclusion in search of an argument. That they are, in fact, believers, right? Believers, and that doesn't make them a conclusion in search of an argument. It makes them open-ended to truth, and they are true seekers in the old-fashioned sense of that term. And so, I share a great hope for the future of the church. It's going to be smaller, but it's going to be a group of people that are true spiritual seekers. Rodney, you want to chime in?
Yeah, no, just to say I agree with that. I think Balthazar says as the no gets louder, the yes gets louder, and that's kind of apocalyptic way and that's the book of Revelation. I mean, that's clearly how it depicts the situation too. So it seems to me to stand to reason that as long as you kind of have a lukewarm liberalism, you're going to have a lukewarm Christianity that thinks liberalism is Christianity, and all that stuff. But as liberalism gets more fangs, more and more people realize, like, oh no, we can't be that, because they hate us, and that kind of wakens people up to a more vibrant faith. I was watching the interview with Bishop Barron and Patrick Deane the other day, and they kind of got into that discussion about the church in different eras. And in the 50s, even really, really smart people like Jacques Maritain were arguing that, oh yeah, liberalism and Catholicism are totally compatible. And, John Courtney Murray, these are just articles of peace, and all that stuff. And it's very, very hard to make that argument in 2023. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a blessing. One of the analogs for our age is the collapse of Christianity in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean with the rise of Islam. And the bizarre fact, which I didn't know until 2 or 3 years ago, was that most Christians didn't really see Islam as another thing, as a different thing. They saw it as the new version of our thing. And so through a process of osmosis lasting a few hundred years, they became Islamic. And they didn't realize it for the longest time. And a similar thing, I think, is happening in this process where we become, sort of a syncretistic Christian and Muslim, and then in 2 or 3 generations we become full Muslim. In the same way, you got syncretistic secularists and Christians. Then over a few generations they become full secularist. But we have 2 advantages, I think. One, hopefully we've got a lot of people who are saying we've got to fight to stop this happening. And then 2, the West is more explicitly anti-Christian than Islam was. And like my daughter, whom I love and who's wonderful and super smart, but she goes to a Catholic school and she's involved in massive amounts of activism on behalf of the oppressed. Now, there are a group of old ladies who once a year will gather outside a hospital in which abortions are being performed, and they will pray quietly. I know, because I stood with them one time, and everybody passing by, not everybody, but a significant portion, will abuse them, will say horrific things to them, will spit on them. Like, if you're looking for oppression, like, these are people literally being spat on in the street, and that should indicate to us the level of hostility or the common section behind any story about Christianity. And it is forcing us, and I think that's a wonderful way. I haven't seen that interview yet, but as the no becomes louder, the yes will become louder too. I think that's a positive thing. I often think about, in Ireland, we had it's one of the forgotten stories, but we got independent in 1921, and the state was overwhelmingly Catholic until about 1990 or so. And in 1921, about 10% of all churchgoers in the southern part of Ireland were Church of Ireland. They were Anglicans. And that was winnowed back to less than 1% by 1990. And so that absolute collapse it's telling. What happened was that the Irish society created a situation where they said, you were responsible for all the historic evils, you're the baddie, and then created a society in which you couldn't be properly Irish and properly Anglican. And so it became an extremely toxic ecosystem in which they simply shriveled up and died. The same is happening here. And I tell students that if I could go back in time and talk to a Church of Ireland person, I'd say, fight. Don't let this historical story be told, because all my students, they fully accept the historical reading where the church was, conquistadors were sitting around minding their own business, and the church said, "Go do genocide on our bidding," and sent them off. And that this is just one stage in a history of genocidal evil perpetuated by the church, and it's rubbish. And we need to have the guts and the martyrdom guts to stand up in an academic level and say, no, this isn't the case. And but hopefully the church will raise up such leaders who will have that kind of courage, because that's what we have to do. Because or else we will be
Yeah.
as numerous as the Catholics are in Algeria today. You know.
Yeah. As someone who was involved in the science and religion dialogue, I wrote a book on it. So I'd go to these conferences and they would still, I mean, highly educated people would still throw up the Galileo affair. You know,
Yeah.
is they know exactly what happened, which is Galileo had the truth, and the church came in and inquisitors and put him down because they were all these benighted nitwits who didn't understand science and so on.
Yeah.
So Galileo's and the historical reality of this course far more. I mean, the fact is Galileo was a bit of a prick.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, but there were personalities involved
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
All right, the Pope, former
Yeah.
friend of Galileo's, who felt betrayed, and so on and so forth. It's a long story, but anyway, yes, we have to have the guts to be able to stand up in the public square.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, I keep using John Newhouse's language. You know, the
Yeah.
public
Yeah.
square,
All right.
public
Yeah.
square
Yeah.
carries with it certain neocon connotations, but I think you know what I mean. But anyway, we've been at this a while now. But before we do sign off, and Rodney, you can chime in too and say what you want. But I don't want to leave the impression with our viewers, because you make a point in your book. I don't want to leave the impression that you're just sort of anti-modern world all the way down.
Mhm.
Okay. You do make a point like, okay, you know, the modern world has given us certain gains. So I'm going to be critical of this slice of it, because this slice of it has led to the following deleterious consequences, sort of across the board. And they're horrible consequences and very bad for our culture. But you're not to, like, I like to tell people, I'd rather like antibiotics, flush toilets, and cheese puffs.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You know, and so yeah, there are, even Ratzinger has mentioned, yes, there are things within the liberal order that were in fact drawn from Christian truths, however now distorted, that were advances. There's no other way to put it. So maybe you could talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, the first thing is that what I try to do is identify what I call an aspect of the genetic code of the modern secular West, which is um, a certain set of epistemological and ontological positions. And it is these epistemological and ontological positions and the things they lead to that I'm opposed to. Many, countless wonderful things have occurred. Although the more I go on, the less I'm convinced by them. But in general, we can say that there is far too much misogyny and patriarchy in the history of the church, and that a lessening of that is a good thing. When popes, you know, take Jewish children hostage, this this is
Yeah.
not good. Like, no question. And on countless occasions, we failed, and we've got to be aware of that. We've often become too complicit in power, and therefore, or disentanglement from the structures of power, I think is a very positive thing. I don't have any nostalgia for one reason, that I'm not morally good enough to have nostalgia, that I am far too sold out to the decadence and the easy pleasures of today's world to be nostalgic. I couldn't go back. Um, and so I don't have any nostalgia. What I would say though is that some of the critiques against nostalgia are are crazy, that it's perfectly right for someone in Gaza right now or someone in Ukraine right now to be nostalgic for that time before we were getting bombed. Like, it's, and sometimes there are things which we ought lament. And so the book isn't a Jeremiad against the modern world at all. But it does identify certain fundamental aspects of the epistemology of ontology and ontology of the modern West, which need to be opposed. And, one stage I talk about Carthago delenda est, Cato's, and that is simply the case. Where they grow, we will die, and we do need to oppose them, and we ought, But certainly, there are many positive things which at certain times can be hard to find, but there are many, many positive things. Um, the the evangelical and missiological impetus of the church since the Second Vatican Council is a wonderfully positive thing. Our
Yeah.
awareness of clericalism as a pathology is, is a wonderful thing. Um, there are many things that are, that are far better now than than they were in the past. And my critique of the modern secular is a critique of the reduction of the natural order to the banal, the reduction of reason to operation in relation to things that are measurable and quantifiable.
Yeah.
And these are things which, which must be opposed. And then I show in the book how core aspects of contemporary moral argumentation in relation to sex and sexuality, in relation to death and dying, in relation to abortion, are predicated upon these epistemological and ontological moves. And so in order to oppose them, we need to show this, and we need to show the problems, while also reconnecting our own voices with the beautiful Trinitarian grammar, which ultimately and originally drove them. And so that's the goal. But there is no, there is no unringing a bell. There is no, going back.
Yeah.
And and for all the talk about people who are nostalgic, I don't know anybody who would say, "Oh, if only I could go back to 1890 and hostage some Jewish child in Rome and baptize them." I don't know anybody, and I'm sure they're out there. Like Twitter, is where they'd be hanging out. But I don't know any rational person who would say, the forced baptism of children is
If
a good thing.
I could be wrong, and maybe my viewers could correct me, but I do believe that the Dominican Romana Cesario did defend that papal action in the pages of First Things about 10 years ago, right, Rodney?
Yeah,
Wowzers.
I can't remember if it was a robust defense or a sort of weak, I'm not really, yeah,
Yeah,
it was not good. Yeah.
it was not good. It was kind of like, well, you could see his point, we can see why the Pope would do that. But anyway, Rodney, you go, you can get some last words in here too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just have, this has been a pleasure talking about this. I really enjoyed the book. I kind of think the subtitle, there was an article that, or no, a talk that was given by, I think it was Luke Timothy Johnson many years ago now. What is Catholic about Catholic biblical scholarship? And I think that a good subtitle for this book would have been, what is Catholic about Catholic moral
Yeah,
theology?
for
Yeah.
sure.
But that's, I think what you're doing is just helping us recover the Catholic roots of Catholic moral theology. That just sounds like something that really needs to be done. So I appreciated it.
Fantastic. Well,
I
thank you
have
so
one.
much.
Well, I have one more follow-up question because I know, I beg your indulgence here, and your patience
Oh,
already been
great.
very long. But you mentioned, the Trinitarian grammar that we enter into this, and one of the things I get from your book, and from reading George Grant and Marshall McLuhan and all kinds of other people, is, you know, it, it's not possible, it seems to me, ontologically, for the Trinitarian life of God as the church brings it into the world to ensconce itself in a culture dominated by a technocratic paradigm, by an ontology rooted in the technocratic paradigm. Now, I take that as a given that those two things are incommensurate. Uh, Therefore, if they are incommensurate, and reading George Grant, that has been very, very helpful in a sense. And I know, gosh, this is taking us way off. We probably shouldn't bring this up here at the last second. Where is the line of demarcation? In other words, we don't want to become Catholic Amish, right? Just running off to our compounds with our buried school buses, with our hand grenades embossed with Our Lady of Fatima on them, and so on and so forth. We we don't want to,
Yeah,
become Catholic
yeah,
Essenes, waiting the
yeah.
apocalyptic doomsday. But on the other hand, we can't just sort of graft Trinitarian life into the interstices or the cracks in the sidewalk of this technocratic paradigm.
Yeah. Great, absolute great point. This is one of the reasons why finishing the book will be a good thing. Chapter 6 looks at the Mass, and the basic argument there, as I looked at the way Calvin and Luther Calvin reduces the sacred to a sliver in time, and Luther reduces the sacred to a sliver in space. And the Mass should be, and I offer a grammar for how it ought to be understood, should be the wellspring of refusing this tyranny of the banal and encouraging us to see the natural order and
Yeah.
creation itself as anything but banal. And so what I argue is that the reforms that I'm calling for in terms of moral theology can't be conducted outside of a reinvigoration of how we understand the liturgy and how we understand the Mass, and both are of a piece. The the yeah, and this is why I defend a transubstantive grammar, that the language of transubstantiation is not the only language, and this is one of the reasons why I'm always fascinated, as we're reading today, with the Basil Athanasius correspondence, because they use different grammars for saying the same thing. And so we need to use the Thomistic grammar, but what the Thomistic grammar says, I think, is so important. And so I think the Mass is the source of that. But these things, it took us a while to iron these things out. As a child, I remember growing up, and before you'd set off on a journey, before you'd start doing hay or you'd start doing potatoes, there'd be prayer. Everything was understood as as a theological activity, and it took us a long time to acquiesce with the tyranny of the secular banal and
Yeah.
have that erased.
Yeah.
And so I do think we need to do some liturgical reform, which is going to be part and parcel of restoring that grammar.
Well, the reason why I asked that, I did read the last chapter, and I wanted you to end on that note. The way I prepare for these interviews when I have a book, I read the first chapter, I read the last chapter, and then I try to read as much in the middle as I possibly can. There's only one chapter that I didn't read, in Deane and the Tyranny of Despair. That's the only chapter I really didn't get it. I read everything else, but I was hoping that you were going to talk about the Eucharist. We're doing a Eucharistic revival here in the United States right now.
Yeah, we too in our little archdiocese.
And you know what? And when they first announced that, I was like, oh, geez, just another bureaucratic BS. But it's actually bearing fruit. I think it's actually a wonderful thing. It's been very moving to see the various pilgrimages and processions and so on. It's been great.
Yeah, I love a good procession. Absolutely love
all right,
procession.
But anyway, all right. Yeah. I have I begged your patience here long enough. We've been at this about an hour and 25 minutes. So thank you, David, for coming on.
I'm really grateful to you both for this conversation and for having me on, and thank you so much for the kind words about the book. Coming from you too, it means an awful lot, and I'm very grateful to you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I can't recommend enough the book, The Tyranny of the Banal. And folks, it is expensive. I think my copy was like $80 or something like that. That's standard. But I want, if you have the money, I'm serious. This is a really great book, and it is worth having in your library.
And so, if you don't, email me, and there might be a PDF copy in the.
There you go. You heard it right here on Gaudium et Spes 22. All right. Well, thank you, Rodney, too, for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rodney. Thanks, so much,
guys.